All right, hi again. I'm just going to pick up on the lymphatic and immune systems and leave the last couple slides on the cardiovascular system unlectured on. Please don't worry about it. I had a little bit of trouble downloading the rest of the video, and for some reason just cutting off the last 30 seconds made it work, so we're going to go with that. For the lymphatic and immune systems, the main thing I want to talk about before we get started is the lymphatic system itself is the solids, the vessels, the organs, the lymph nodes that are sort of carrying out a lot of our immune activities, housing those immune cells, but they are separate. The lymphatic system is mostly just for filtering body fluids, interstitial fluid, and mainly blood plasma. The immune system is our defense mechanism against pathogens trying to get into the body, and it's a functional system, so it includes a whole bunch of different organs and cells and chemicals with complex interrelationships sort of working together. It does include a lot of the lymphatic organs as well as lymphocytes. The main immune system cell, the main immune system fighter, is a lymphatic cell or a lymphocyte. So the lymphatic system, again, is the solids. We're returning fluids back to circulation that have leaked out. We're also trying to return good ions. A lot of the fluid comes with some salt that we might need. The lymphatic system can be broken down into three parts. The vessels, think veins. They are very, very similar to veins, as you can see off to the left here. The green is signifying that lymphatic fluid, and they are much, much more condensed around areas of major arteries and veins so that they can catch all of that fluid being pushed through that's leaking out of those blood vessels. Lymph fluid is all of that interstitial fluid, all of that plasma that's leaked out, collected. The second it enters a lymph vessel, it becomes lymph fluid. And lymph nodes, these are collections of solid lymph tissue. Usually there are many B cells producing more plasma cells, and we'll talk about plasma cells in just a second. And there are tons and tons of T cells, our other lymphocyte, that are going to attack pathogens, make sure all of that interstitial fluid and plasma that's going to be returned is cleansed. It's always working, always filtering, as the circulatory system is always pumping blood through the body. Lymphoid organs include the spleen, thymus, tonsils, and lymph nodes. Lymphatic vessels are just a drainage system of tubes. We are coiled very, very closely around the blood vessels. One of the biggest differences between the venous system and the lymphatic vessels is that there is no organ attached to this continuously pumping. We do know that with venous blood, it almost doesn't matter. By the time blood trickles through capillaries and enters venules, the pressure is very, very low, so it's not really helping push that blood through circulation all that much. But lymph fluid doesn't even have that. So it's relying on all of those sort of passive methods that venous return relies on, like smooth and skeletal muscle contraction, any movements in the thoracic cavity sort of changing in pressure pushes on those really sort of flimsy walled vessels. This is very sporadic and slow because it is based entirely on body movement, which means the more you move, the more fluid is spreading. This is also why when you have an infection, it is a really good idea to rest lots. Obviously, the rest is also helping your body to heal, but not moving quite so much, physically laying down, will sort of stop the spread of that lymphatic fluid and potentially stop the spread of some of those infectious cells or chemicals into other tissues. Our lymphatic cells are going to be our lymphocytes, our T cells, and our B cells. Remember that T cells are the ones actually carrying out the destruction, right? They're the fighters for the immune system. The B cells, they make these little baby cells that they're called plasma cells. They don't last for a very long time, and their only function is to secrete antibodies, a ton of antibodies that mark a specific antigen And once that antigen has been tagged by an antibody, an activated T cell of some sort, or a macrophage or a dendritic cell, anything big that is going to engulf or lyse that pathogen will come and find it based on that antibody sort of tag. Lymphoid tissue is physically where lymphocytes are hanging out, sort of monitoring all of the fluid being pushed around them. It's also a proliferation site, which means that they are developing and dividing. A lot of the germinal centers in the middle of blood vessels contain a lot of B cells, and this is where they will be making and pushing out extra plasma cells as well. The types of lymphatic tissue that we have: diffuse lymphoid tissue, lymphoid follicles, and then we will talk about lymph nodes. Diffuse lymphoid tissue is that loose mesh that will be found particularly around every body organ. We have fascia, we have connective tissue, sort of sleeves around every single soft tissue organ within the body. Within that connective tissue layer somewhere, there's going to be diffuse lymphoid tissue as well. It's spider webbing of a huge amount of immune cells just to continuously keep that external sort of extracellular space around those vital organs free of pathogens that might destroy or hinder the tissues. Our follicles or nodules, these are solid bodies within the tissue. These are really big places of B cell proliferation, germinal centers, right? They're all hanging out clustered together, and when they're triggered, they will be producing all of those plasma cells to push out. Lymphoid organs can be divided into two functional categories: primary and secondary. Primary are going to be acting directly against pathogens. They are going to be cleaning the lymphatic fluid as it passes through those lymph nodes. When we talk about the endocrine system, there are also primary and secondary endocrine organs for the same reason. Primary endocrine organs are directly secreting, secondary are assisting in secretion or storing hormones, more of a support role. Our primary lymphoid organs are going to be red bone marrow and the thymus. Red bone marrow is producing all of our white blood cells, so all of our lymphocytes, T cells and B cells. The only reason we're including the thymus is because T cells mature there. Right after birth, a lot of our T cells are still immature and in transit. They make their way through the bloodstream to the thymus, where they kind of hang out until they encounter pathogens and begin to sort of develop some immunological memory. Secondary lymphoid organs, this is where mature lymphocytes are going to be actually encountering antigens. Lymph nodes, spleen, and MALT, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues. It's a really fancy way of saying just loose, dense, packed collections of a lot of lymphatic follicles, a lot of those lymphatic centers of just dense B cells with few T cells and a little bit of connective tissue surrounding. This includes the tonsils, Peyer's patches, and the appendix. So the tonsils is going to be at the entrance of the pharynx, covering that entire oral opening. The appendix is going to be at the end of the large intestine or the colon, so really big in the digestive areas. We also have some aggregated lymphoid tissue in the small intestine, but Peyer's patches are going to be within the walls of the small intestine themselves. So anywhere that bacteria, viruses, some of the chemicals and toxins secreted by those two things is trying to breach into the body, either from the external environment or from within the organ walls itself. Lymph nodes, I want you to pay very clear attention to the structure of a lymph node. Again, this will mirror the kidney setup very, very similarly. These are the most important secondary lymphoid tissues because they are constantly filtering the lymph fluid. This is where all that quote unquote bad stuff is pulled from that extracellular fluid from that blood plasma. So two basic protective functions: cleansing the lymph. We just talked about that. There will be macrophages hanging out there. There will be extra enzymes ready to destroy microorganisms. There will be white blood cells ready to phagocytize, remove any of the debris. The second is to activate the immune system. Because we have so many lymphocytes hanging out in lymphatic tissue and in lymph nodes, this is a really strategic point for them to be set up to interact with pathogens that have entered the body tissues or entered the bloodstream. The structure of a lymph node, basically, he's shaped like a bean. He's got a really dense network of connective tissue within, separating the softer tissue that is actually doing the filtration on the inside into different nodes or lobules. There's a dense fibrous capsule on the outside, keeping all of that soft filtration tissue sort of enclosed. Two regions here, the cortex and medulla. This is exactly the same as the kidney will be. Again, a lot of our organs have this set up, with the cortex being a little bit thinner and on the outside more dense. This is going to be our superficial part, so it's going to be a lot sort of harder to penetrate, right? Our protective external layer. So this is a lot of follicles where B cells will be developing. They'll be preparing to make some of those plasma cells once they interact with pathogens. Deeper into the cortex, we'll start seeing more T cells. T cells are constantly moving. They move through lymphatic fluid, they move through the lymph nodes, and they move through the blood. They are just sort of free floating through any moving liquid type tissue in order to interact by chance, basically, with pathogens or with any cell that has been marked with an antibody. The cortex also has many dendritic cells. These guys are just capturing more antigens and bringing them to the T and B cells so that they can handle the immune response. The sinuses are going to be the larger capillaries, where a lot of the macrophages who are doing the physical cleaning of that lymph fluid are hanging out and just waiting. Circulation in the lymph nodes, this is important. Afferent, arriving, afferent. This will be the same when we talk about the kidneys and the glomeruli again. Afferent lymphatic vessels are arriving into the sort of external curvature of the lymph node. Once we enter the lymph node, we go into a subcapsular sinus, right? Just below the capsule of a lymph node. The sinus is just going to be an opening where there are a lot of macrophages waiting. They're kind of just free floating in fluid that is in circulation, attached to reticular connective fibers. Then we trickle down into smaller and smaller fibers, smaller and smaller sinuses until we reach the medulla. In the medulla, we have more sinuses. We're trickling down and we're slowing down the flow of fluid because we're going into smaller and smaller and smaller vessels. One of the ways that we slow down lymph fluid is also by having less efferent lymphatic vessels leaving a lymph node than we do have afferent entering. Because there are less pathways to get out of the lymph node, lymph fluid is sort of captured in there for a little bit. This is another form of a bottleneck, and that bottleneck is called the hilum. This is where all of the vessels are going to be exiting the lymph node. When we talk about the kidneys, the ureter, as well as the renal artery and vein will be exiting through the hilum, exiting and entering through the hilum, I should say. The spleen, this guy is our largest lymphatic organ. He is very, very rich with blood because his job is so intertwined with the destruction of red blood cells as well as sort of maintaining iron and hemoglobin levels. This is located on the superior surface of the Stomach a little bit more towards the front, and it's on the left side of the body. It's supplied with a splenic artery and vein. This is another site for lymphocytes to hang out, wait for that blood to come through and be filtered. So again, he has three really important jobs with maintaining the cleanliness of blood. He's getting rid of red blood cells. He's destroying them so that we can take that heme group and that iron and transport it to the liver, where it can be further broken down and degraded and removed from the body as bile. It does keep some of the iron there. This guy also is storing platelets and monocytes. Monocytes are our largest white blood cell. And when they enter tissues, these guys become macrophages and start eating parasites or bacteria. The spleen has a fibrous capsule and is very similar in setup to the lymph nodes. Those trabeculae are the extensions of those fibrous materials, that fibrous connective tissue, usually reticular connective tissue, extending inward to divide the spleen up into specific areas. In the spleen, we're talking about red pulp and white pulp. Because the spleen is so blood rich, there is much more red pulp. This is the site of RBC destruction and bloodborne pathogen destruction, anything that has sort of come along to be filtered with those red blood cells. White pulp, this is where lymphocytes are suspended in those reticular fibers. This is where the immune function takes place. We have white blood cells interacting with antigens of some sort. This is coating the arteries almost like a glove, because arteries have higher pressure, so they're pushing out more interstitial fluid, and they are more likely to be releasing any pathogens that are being circulated through the body. MALT are mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues. Again, basically, these are just collections of those lymphatic follicles at areas where bacteria wants to grow, wants to develop, wants to enter the body tissues. Thin, moist mucous membranes are great for bacterial proliferation especially. And they're also easy ways for things to enter, like bacteria and viruses, because we eat food, we put things in our mouths, we touch our face often, we put our hands near our mouth, we eat with our hands, and there's natural bacteria within all of our small and large intestines, and maintaining that balance there can be hard as well. The tonsils form the ring around the pharynx, or the opening of the mouth. There are several of them, and they're named for their locations. I'm not going to ask you to name each and every one of them. Just know that they are surrounding the pharynx. I will point out that the pharyngeal tonsil, the one at the very, very back, is called an adenoid when it is enlarged. So tonsils are not membrane bound. They're just collections with a thin epithelial layer. The epithelial layer forms nice grooves in those surfaces, and because they're in mucosal areas, those grooves fill with mucus and then act as sticky traps to collect any foreign bacteria or particles that we would want removed, especially from the pharynx where things are being breathed in as well. We want to get all of those debris sort of collected and removed before air hits the lungs. Peyer's patches, again, these guys are in the intestinal wall, stopping any bacteria, good or bad, down there from breaching that intestinal wall. And the appendix, again, instead of for the small intestine, this guy is for the large intestine. He is also helping us to recognize a lot of those food pathogens. So the thymus is very interesting because T cells basically activate here. This is where they mature. A lot of times this might be where they first encounter a pathogen. But pretty much the thymus is only active really early on in life, Once we hit puberty, it begins to decrease in size. It does continue to make active T cells, but by the time you're an adult, has shrunk very, very small. Thymic corpuscles, these guys are the lobes or the separations of the thymus. They're surrounded by epithelium. We don't have connective tissue on the outside of this clearly lymphatic organ. The rest of the organs did. Some of our just tissue patches didn't have connective tissue envelopes or connective tissue capsules, but the thymus is a little bit special. Something about T cell development wants that sort of more soft, neutral environment. There's a lot more diffusion that can happen, so a lot of those nutrients that are needed for T cell development can pass through. The thymus doesn't contain any B cells at all, so he is not developing any antibodies. Our immune system is going to be our functional system that uses quite a bit of the lymphatic system, always. Lymphatic system is maintaining blood volume by filtering plasma. It is also introducing a lot of those pathogens to the immune system, but the immune system is a separate functional system. The immune system can be divided down into innate and adaptive defenses. These work individually. They also work in conjunction with one another almost entirely. Both of them together, sort of hand in hand, give us some sort of resistance to specific pathogens, specific diseases. This is called immunity. The innate defense system is nonspecific, although it is not as nonspecific as once thought. There are chemicals released by certain tissues that activate against specific bacteria or specific viruses or specific chemicals. It's always prepared to respond, though, because this is the tissues themselves or whoever is local responding to that assault. Our most external, our first line of defense is going to be those physical barriers, the skin or any mucosa lining the internal membranes. Once the skin or those membranes have been breached, we need a second line of defense. This is still an innate line of defense, though. When we talked about abrasions of any sort of trauma, inflammation is always step one. When tissues are damaged, there is inflammation because the cells themselves and nearby white blood cells release histamine to make those tissues swell. We also have antimicrobial proteins and phagocytes naturally in the area because we talked about how positive chemotaxis occurs. Those white blood cells can actually creep around through the tissues, squeaking in and out of circulation to find those pathogens, those foreign invaders. And then secondarily, we have the adaptive defense system. This takes a lot longer to activate, and the innate defense system is what is going to activate this adaptive defense system. The adaptive system is much more specific. It's seeking out and attacking antigens that it's already marked by antibodies. This is sort of our third line defense. But again, it takes a much longer time to mount this response, and innate defenses are sort of a snap, immediate fix to the problem. Both systems are deeply intertwined, yes, because the innate system is what actually recognizes and triggers the adaptive system. They also release a lot of the same molecules. Histamine, for example, is also used by the adaptive system and released. Innate responses are not as nonspecific as was once thought. Long ago, it was assumed that any of the chemicals released by cells in the local area were the same regardless of the body tissue. That's not so. There are certain body tissues that are specifically set up to fight against specific pathogens that they cross paths with most often. And again, the innate system is what is activating the adaptive system in the first place. The immune system has all of these different molecules and cells and chemicals that are constantly circulating through body fluids. So without the blood system, the circulatory system transporting these things, without lymph fluid transporting through the body to move some of those lymphocytes, to move some of that extra plasma, our immune system would not be functional. When operating effectively, obviously we have very good defenses against most foreign invaders trying to regularly attack, cause mayhem within our body, or right here, cancer cells. Our immune system is also handling trouble within. If we have cells dividing uncontrollably or going through mitosis in a dysfunctional manner, producing a lot of non-functional cells, that's also problematic. So we take care of that internally as well. Our very, very first line of defense is physical, and it's the skin and mucous membranes. Mucous membranes pretty much all have some sort of cell within them secreting a mucus or mucin-based substance. Skin, when we talked about the integumentary system, it is keratinized, so nice hard proteins. The external surface is all made of dead cells. So to get to anything good, you have to pass through basically the entire epidermis as a microbe. Aside from the physical barrier itself, skin also secretes a few acids. We have a few bases that are bacterial resistant naturally. So again, acids secreted by both of these. The acid mantle is a huge sort of functional systems interrelationship, again, where we have all of these places commonly exposed to bacteria, commonly exposed to viral pathogens. And they have these adaptations to produce acid. And the acid mantle is important because it occurs on the epidermis, that external layer of the skin, in the vagina, an external opening, and in the stomach, where we're putting pretty much all of that food initially. That's the first stop it gets to, and we need to neutralize any of the bad bacterial growth that might have happened on it. Enzymes are really important for food breakdown, but also for destroying anything that might be hiding in that food. We have lysozyme in saliva and respiratory mucus. Tears, lacrimal fluid contain some lysozyme. They also contain some other digestive enzymes to get rid of bacteria. We also have protein digesting enzymes to get rid of microorganisms in the stomach. So up here, lysozyme is pretty, I'm going to call him broad spectrum. He's a broad spectrum enzyme. He likes to destroy bacteria, but he's not really all that picky about it. This is a protein digesting enzyme in the stomach. Once we get to the stomach, we have already bypassed the mouth. Hopefully in the respiratory mucosa, the lysozyme will take care of it. And in the tears, we have just basically entered the body. And we have a couple other secondary defenses in the eyes for removing things such as blinking, the eyelashes. The protein digesting enzyme in the stomach is somewhat special because by the time pathogens of any sort have reached the stomach, if they haven't already been destroyed and the acid of the stomach doesn't destroy them, they clearly have a very thorough coat or protective covering. But that coat will be made of protein of some sort. And if they are a virus, that protein coat is broken down relatively quickly. And then once the internal RNA or the genetic material is exposed, that is much more delicate tissue, and acids break all of the RNA and all of the DNA down rapidly because acids destroy hydrogen bonds, and those hydrogen bonds keep those molecules structures intact. Mucin, again, this is secreted by pretty much any mucous membrane tissue. There's one exception, and that would be the urethra, the urinary tract. Defensins, this is another molecule. These are antimicrobial peptides, so just big proteins that the body creates and releases to attack and destroy particularly bacterial and fungal colonies. We have other chemicals, including some fats secreted on the surface of the skin that are toxic to specific bacteria commonly found on the skin or commonly found to infect skin. The respiratory tract mucosa has a couple other fancy sort of advancements to keep particles out of those lungs. We have nose hairs, and then there are cilia in the upper respiratory tracts that beat to keep any foreign pathogen and any debris that we might inhale away from those lungs, to keep them out of the alveoli. We don't want to block any of that gas diffusion from taking place. Once we have bypassed all of this, once the abrasion is deep enough and pathogens have infiltrated the body that way, once they've broken through the intestinal wall, or if they haven't been degraded by the acid mantle or any of our other innate defenses, we need to call on adaptive defenses. We need to mount a better immune response. And this is more cells releasing more chemicals.